The wind came off the Sangre de Cristo range like a knife that morning, dry and sharp, stirring dust and ghosts alike. Abel Connolly rode with one eye on the bruised horizon and one hand grazing the warm butt of his revolver. A storm had rolled through the night before, snarling fence lines and snapping posts like matchsticks. He was no stranger to the wild whims of this land, but something about the silence today gnawed at him, too still, too watchful. A scream of hooves tore through the hush. A mustang, riderless and lathered in foam, bolted past him from the ridge. Its reins whipped like a snake, blood crusted along its flanks. Abel turned in the saddle, spitting a curse under his breath. Horses didn't run like that for no reason, not in these parts. He followed the trail through a cottonwood hollow, where the trees hung low like mourners in prayer. And there, suspended from a twisted limb, was a sight that stopped his breath cold. A girl Apache, no older than 12, dangling from a rawhide loop cinched beneath her arms. Her legs hung limp, toes grazing blood-darkened leaves. A wooden placard slapped softly against her chest in the breeze. "White man don't forgive." The letters carved rough, burned in with black powder. Abel's stomach clenched. His horse sidled and neighed, sensing the death in the air. He swung down, boots crunching dry twigs. Her head lolled, raven black hair matted across her cheeks. But she moved. Just barely, a tremor in her fingers. He rushed forward, drawing his hunting knife. The rawhide cut like bone, resisting every inch. His hands trembled half from fury, half from something deeper, older. He caught her as she dropped, cradling her weight. Her breaths were shallow. Heat blistered her brow. Her skin, dust-caked and bruised, told of days without food or water. He wrapped her in his duster and laid her beside a fallen log. His canteen was nearly empty, but he dripped what he could between her cracked lips. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're all right. You're safe." She didn't stir. As he stared down at the fragile shape in his arms, memory clawed its way up from the cellar of his heart. 2 winters ago, a range war had spilled over his fence line. Men came with torches, whiskey breath, and rifles cocked. They called his wife a squaw lover and burned her alive in the root cellar. His son, 8 years old, never made it past the porch. He buried them in snow that year and built the fence higher. Since then, Abel had spoken little and trusted less. But here, in this grove heavy with death, something broke loose in him. Night fell quickly in the Mesa country. Abel carried the girl, still unconscious, across the ridgeline to an old line shack he built years back, half buried in rock and forgotten. The walls leaned like old drunks, and the roof hissed as wind combed through the slats. Lightning clawed across the sky. Rain hadn't come yet, but he could smell it, iron sage and vengeance. He lit a lantern, spread his blanket near the hearth, and laid her gently upon it. She stirred once, a whimper escaping her lips like a bird in a snare. Abel sat beside her, sharpening his knife more for comfort than use. Thunder rolled. A smell rose up from the earth, the kind that warned a man to move fast. Flash floods in canyon country didn't knock politely. They roared down from nowhere like cavalry charges. The first fat drops struck the roof as Abel threw open the door. "We have to move," he muttered, more to himself than the girl. He bundled her against his chest and staggered out into the dark. The path behind the shack had turned to sludge. His horse bucked at the noise from up valley, a sound like a train screaming through the hills. Abel glanced uphill. Water. A wall. Of it. Mud and logs crashing together in fury. He kicked the stable door open, hoisted the girl onto the horse, and leapt up behind her. "Oh!" he shouted, heels biting into the gelding's flanks. They barely cleared the lower ridge before the arroyo exploded behind them, sweeping the line shack into splinters. Hours later, soaked and shivering beneath an overhang of black rock, Abel felt her stir. She reached up, fingers brushing something on his chest. The rosary, his wife's, worn smooth with years. She touched it once, whispered, "Tiva," and fell limp again. He didn't move. Not for a long time. Then, as the clouds thinned and moonlight broke over the ridge, a sound echoed down the canyon, a sharp, unmistakable crack. A rifle. They weren't alone. The morning came cold and gray, the land cloaked in fog and silence. Abel shifted Tiva's weight in his arms, her breath feather-light against his collarbone. She was too weak to ride, her limbs still slack from dehydration and bruising. So, he walked step by step through rocky passes and thorn-thick trails, leading, his gelding behind him with one hand and carrying her with the other. Every mile between them and his ranch felt like 100. The girl stirred now and then, mumbling sounds he couldn't understand. Her eyes opened once, hazy and sunken, before drifting shut again. Abel tried not to look down at her injuries. Dark. Bruises blooming like ink across her ribs, her lips split and swollen. Whatever had been done to her, it hadn't been meant for mercy. By late afternoon, he found the first sign. A boot print pressed deep in the red dirt beside the dry wash. Not just any boot a cavalry issue from the old days. Nails rusting in the heel, the kind worn by ex-soldiers or bounty men still clinging to war habits. 10 yards later, a circle of blackened sage lay beside a smoldering ember. A warning, or a ritual. Either way, it told Abel someone was behind them and not far. He stared at the print, jaw clenched, the taste of old gunpowder crawling up his throat. He'd thought this land remote enough to avoid the echoes of war. He'd been wrong. They camped in a low ravine that night, near a stand of pinyon trees. Abel propped Tiva up against the base of a boulder, offered her a strip of jerky she couldn't chew. She held it anyway, more for comfort than sustenance. As the firelight flickered across her face, the question returned like it had for days. Should I leave her? She wasn't his daughter, not his kin. She brought danger with every breath. Soldiers would kill to get her back, and he didn't have it in him to fight again. Not really. He remembered the night he buried his son. The earth had frozen so hard. He'd shattered 2 spades digging the grave. And still, he kept digging, kept bleeding, because there was no other choice. Now, another child sat across the fire, her presence pressing on that same fracture in his soul. He didn't know her, but leaving her would mean losing whatever was left of himself. A sudden hiss snapped him upright. His eyes darted left. A rattler, coiled just feet from where Tiva sat, its tail twitching like dry leaves. He started to move too slow. But Tiva, even weakened, raised one trembling hand and pointed. No scream. No cry. Just that small, sharp gesture. Abel lunged. One strike with his blade. The snake writhed and stilled. He dropped beside her, hard hammering. She met his gaze without fear. Her lips didn't move, but something passed between them. An understanding not yet words, but weighty all the same. Later that night, as the fire settled into embers and lightning rumbled behind the distant peaks, Tiva reached into the dirt with one finger. She began to draw. At first, Abel didn't understand. Then the shapes took form crude, but deliberate. A camp, a fire, men with rifles. A girl with a mark on her back. Then a face square-jawed, cold-eyed, framed by an officer's brim. She circled that face in ash and slashed through it twice. Abel exhaled slowly. "Granger," he whispered. "Captain Elijah Granger." Tiva nodded once. The name cracked something wide open. Granger, he remembered that bastard too well. Once a Union officer turned private militia captain, notorious for purges in the Southwest. They'd ridden together once, near Fort Sill, until the day Granger gave the order to burn a peaceful mescalero camp. Women, children. Abel hadn't stayed. He'd thrown his badge into the fire and disappeared into the hills. A deserter with no flag and no home. Now, the child of that burned world sat before him, the ash of it still clinging to her skin. As lightning danced above the mesa, he looked at her again, not as a burden, but as something else. "I'll get you there," he said quietly. "Across the Sierra Blanca, to your people." She watched him, eyes dark as obsidian. "There's a bounty," he added. "They'll come for you. Maybe for me too." Still, she didn't flinch. He reached into his coat, pulled out the jade rosary, and placed it in her palm. She closed her fingers over it. The storm rolled closer, wind rising like breath against their campfire. Abel turned his gaze eastward, where the range lay in shadow. Somewhere out there, a line of blood would be drawn. He knew it. At dawn, they climbed out of the ravine and onto high ground to scout ahead. Abel stopped cold. Across the valley floor, just visible in the silver mist, stood 3 riders, silhouettes unmoving, watching. Farther behind them, orange flickers bloomed like fireflies, signal fires. The hunt had begun. The sky hadn't even begun to pale when the first crack of a rifle shattered the silence. Flames sprang up along the edge of Abel's hay barn, licking dry timbers in hungry streaks of orange. Within heartbeats, the roof whooshed into a single sheet of fire, sparks swirling into the dark like angry spirits. Gun smoke drifted through the yard, mingling with the stench of burning straw and the bawling of panicked cattle. Shapes flitted between fence postmen in dust-caked coats, torches in one hand, carbines in the other fanning out toward the corral. Abel rolled from his bedroll beside the cook fire, pumping shells into his Winchester before his boots even touched dirt. Tiva, jolted awake, took in the chaos with wide eyes, then bolted toward the paddock instead of for cover. Before Abel could shout her back, she unlatched the side gate and slapped the nearest steer hard across the flank. The animal lunged, bellowing, and the rest of the herd followed like a flood of horn and muscle. Dust roared up as hooves churned. The earth, a thick brown wall that swallowed the torchlight. Gunmen cursed, stumbling blind. A torch dropped, sputtering out in the dirt. Abel caught a glimpse of Tiva weaving through the stampede, her small frame vanishing behind a curtain of dust, just as a rifle barked from the shadows. He ducked, answered with 2 quick shots, then bolted after her. Cattle scattered down the slope toward the dry river gorge, drawing the raiders with them. Abel sprinted, levering rounds as he ran. A bullet slapped through his duster and tore into his shoulder. The shock spun him to a knee. Pain hammered up his neck, hot and electric. He shoved himself upright, teeth clenched, and kept moving. Ahead, Tiva darted between boulders, guiding the stampede toward the canyon's throat where narrow walls would funnel pursuers. They reached the rim of the gorge just as the first light of dawn brushed the peaks. Overnight rain upstream had swelled the arroyo into a churning brown torrent. Cattle plunged in anyway, driven by fear, hooves finding only fleeting purchase before the current swept them sideways. Abel caught Tiva's arm. "We cross or we die," he rasped. She nodded, once, eyes reflecting the froth below. A half-fallen cottonwood trunk bridged part of the flood, its root mass snagged on one bank, branches raking the other. Abel slung his rifle, wrapped one arm around Tiva, and together they climbed onto the slick bark. Midway across, water slammed into them with icy force, stealing their balance. Abel felt the world tilt, then the branch cracked, sagged, and dumped them into the flood. Cold sucked the breath from his lungs. The current spun him under. Something sharp ripped past his calf. He surfaced, arm locked around Tiva's waist, both of them gasping amid debris. With his free hand, he grabbed the jut of the trunk. They rode it downstream, half submerged, until calmer eddies let them scramble onto a gravel bar littered with driftwood. Blood spread dark through Abel's sleeve. Dizzy, he slid to his knees. Tiva pressed her hands to the wound, tore a strip from his buckskin saddle cover, and bound the gash with surprising care. He tried to speak, warn her to leave him, to run while she could, but his jaw wouldn't unclench. The world tunneled, sound muffled by the rush of water and his own pulse. He managed one ragged whisper, "Go, find your people." She answered by tightening the knot on his bandage and shaking her head. Rain began again, soft but relentless. A crunch of gravel snapped her attention to the cliffs above. Alone, figure stood outlined against the growing light, tall and still as a stone carving. He wore deer-hide leggings and a blood-red band around his braid, a Mescalero scout's mark. In his left hand hung a bow. In his right, a flint-tipped spear that glinted wet in the dawn. Tiva rose, unafraid, and called out in her native tongue a single word, soft but clear. The man descended the slope, never lowering his spear. Abel forced himself upright, rifle clutched one-handed, though he lacked the strength to rack the lever. The stranger stopped a few strides away. His eyes, coal-black and steady, moved from Abel's bleeding shoulder to Tiva's swollen face. The tension coiled like wire between them until Tiva reached beneath Abel's collar and drew forth the jade rosary. She held it up to the stranger, a silent testimony. Something shifted in his gaze. He spoke to her gentle cadence like water. Over stone, then looked back at Abel. With deliberate calm, he slung his bow, knelt, and set about tightening Abel's bandage with practiced hands. When he finished, he touched his own chest. "Red Moon," he said in accented English. "Uncle." Abel nodded, words stuck in his throat. Gratitude tasted like blood. No more gunfire chased them. The raiders had lost the trail at the flooded ford, but all three knew pursuit would not die so easily. Red Moon led them up a winding goat path into a box canyon whose walls rose steep and crooked, pocked with caves. A natural fort. They worked in silence. Abel, one arm numb, directed what he could. Red Moon stacked shale slabs above a choke point, rigging them with a tripwire woven from horsehair. Tiva gathered pinyon branches, sharpening them into ankle-high spikes and burying them under loose sand. Abel placed his two remaining sticks of dynamite beneath a ledge overlooking the entrance, fusing them with kerosene-soaked cloth. By nightfall, the canyon floor looked untouched, save for the faint scrape of bootprints leading in. Coyotes howled somewhere beyond the ridge. Abel eased himself onto a boulder, exhaustion dragging at every bone. Tiva sat beside him, head against his uninjured shoulder. Red Moon crouched at the narrow mouth of the canyon, silent sentinel, his silhouette framed by the last embers of sunset. All around them, darkness gathered like a held breath, waiting for the dawn when blood and trust would be weighed in equal measure. The sun climbed straight overhead, a white coin hammered against a faultless sky, when the first echo of hooves spilled into the canyon mouth. Granger's riders swept in tight formation, 15 men painted by gun smoke and grit, sabers flashing in noon glare. They crossed the invisible trip line, and the world answered. Shale blocks thundered down like an avalanche of knives, smashing horses, tossing men into rolling dust. Abel loosed the opening volley from his perch. Red Moon's arrows hissed from the opposite rim. Lead and flint crisscrossed the choke point, bullets ricocheting in angry whines. Still the militia pressed on, scrambling over their dead, firing blind at every crack in the stone. Dusk thickened, sunlight broke into shards, and the canyon filled with a roar that swallowed breath and prayer alike. Even pinned, Granger's voice barked orders steady, relentless, a drum keeping broken ranks moving forward toward the kill. Amid the chaos, Abel slid down a rock face and landed 10 paces from the man he once called captain. Granger stepped. From behind a fallen horse, coat scorched, eyes bright as chipped ice. "No forgiveness in war," he sneered, cocking his Spencer. Abel raised the Henry, sighted center mass, and squeezed click. Misfire. Jammed by wind-blown grit. Granger laughed, closing the gap with the calm of a butcher. "You always lack the spine, Connolly." Abel dropped the rifle, drew his Colt. With his good arm, but too slowly. The shoulder wound screamed, fire lancing through bone. Granger leveled his barrel, then the canyon floor convulsed. Tiva, small as a shadow, had slipped through broken lines to the malicious powder mule. One swift cut and the keg split open, black grain spilling. She trailed a fuse of gun cotton. Back toward loose embers, eyes fixed on Abel. Spark met powder, an instant of silence. Then a concussive boom split the gorge. Flame corkscrewed skyward, horses screamed, men scattered beneath a rain of shattered rock. The blast severed Granger's line of sight, hurled him and Abel opposite directions, stunned but alive. Smoke rolled outward, turning noon into twilight. When vision cleared, Red Moon saw Granger stagger upright, pistol swinging toward Tiva through drifting ash. Without pause, the mescalero darted from cover, put his own body between Nice and bullet. The shot cracked, punching into his chest. He didn't falter. His spear sailed, pinning Granger's coat to a timber. A second slug caught Red Moon. The side, spinning him down beside Tiva. She cried out, pressing trembling hands to the blooming red across his deer-hide shirt. But blood pulsed too fast, too bright. Abel, ears ringing, crawled to his Colt as Granger freed himself, leg ruined. By shrapnel. The captain tried to raise his weapon again. Abel's revolver barked first, shattering the pistol and mangling Granger's shooting hand. The older man collapsed, propped against stone, breathing curses through clenched teeth. Abel dragged himself over, pistol steady on the man's heart. Memories of fire and buried kin hammering behind his eyes. Granger's lip curled. "Finish it, coward." Abel's finger tightened, then eased. He holstered the Colt, tore the placard from his saddle, "White man don't forgive," and with charcoal scratched new words. "Nitrogen monoxide, man forgives hate." He hung it around Granger's neck, snapped the soldier's saber in two, and kicked it aside. "Find your own mercy," he said, turning away as the wounded captain screamed after him, voice swallowed by wind. Red Moon's breath rattled beneath the lone juniper that crowned a rise overlooking the canyon. Sunset bled crimson across the sky, mirroring the stain on his chest. Abel and Tiva dug with knife and shard, hands raw until earth yielded a shallow cradle. They laid the scout within, his bow across his ribs, obsidian point toward the rising moon. Tiva set the jade rosary at his heart. Abel spoke a prayer half remembered from childhood, half sculpted from the silence of this fierce land. The girl pressed her forehead to the mound, whispering words too old for translation. Coyotes answered from distant ridges, carrying his spirit. West Dawn found the two travelers on the edge of mescalero territory, where cottonwoods thickened along a clear stream. Smoke curled from lodges beyond. Voices drifted on morning wind. Tiva paused, fingers still gripping Abel's sleeve. He pressed the rosary into her palm. "Your uncle kept his word. I'll keep mine." She closed her fist around the stone beads, eyes shimmering between grief and hope. He watched her cross the meadow until elders emerged to gather her in. Then he turned, leading his gelding back toward empty horizons. Hoofbeats faded. Abel's voice carries over the final frame, rough but certain. In a land that remembers. Every scar, what does forgiveness cost? Tell me what you choose, justice, mercy, or the trail between. Like this tale. Share your own in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories etched in dust and blood. Until next ride, keep your heart steady and your aim true.